Right now in Sudan, anarchist comrades are organizing in the middle of a war, repression, and displacement. The anarchist group in Sudan is building mutual aid, grassroots committees, and political education for survival and liberation. And they need our support. You can stand with them by making a one-time donation, holding your own fundraiser and sending the funds to the Open Collective, Support Sudanese Comrades, link in bio, or become a monthly supporter at that same Open Collective link. Every contribution strengthens their ability to keep resisting and caring for their people. Solidarity means action. Tap the link in our bio or in the show notes and support the anarchist group in Sudan today.
Hello and welcome to the Dugout. Thank you. I know y'all have been long awaiting the second part of the Harriet Tubman book. I am not going to bore you too much with an intro. I'm excited to get this little episode out. It ends with an epic story, great build-up, great context. Definitely going to try to get some more of these out for y'all, especially for season 3. We're going to be putting a lot of effort into our season 3 episodes, so having these chill ones for y'all and getting these in are an absolute honor. Have fun. Freedom is the recognition of necessity. Young Harriet was a part of this rising and aware, despite the prison culture she grew up in, of the larger events. As the explosive ripple of Nat Turner's uprising spread, for example, she and other captives were to legally gather at night of the few literate, free New Africans. The latter were allowed to buy newspapers and would read aloud to their sisters and brothers about the trials and political storm that the uprising had caused. In 1849, Harriet heard that she and her brothers were about to be sold south. Harriet saw the life-threatening reality and freed herself to deal with it. She had already lost 2 sisters and their children who had been sold south and who would never be found again. If she were to be taken on the chain gangs deeper into the south, into malarial rice plantations or harsh plantation lands being cleared into territory strange to her, her chances of escaping were much less. Harriet was out of there. Time to jet. She joined the Underground Railroad and escaped. Harriet left behind her husband, who was a free Negro and who refused to go. It says it all, doesn't it? That he objected to Harriet's escaping. He who was not in danger of being sold away, John Tubman, wasn't willing to risk his privileged status just because his wife was in mortal danger. Hey, he wouldn't go north, and you know he wasn't going further south. You can always get another wife, and he did. Ironically, he should have been more principled, because right after the Civil War, he was shot in the back and killed by a white woman he had argued with. Her 2 brothers tried to escape after hearing the rumors, taking Harriet with them. But that night, without supplies and knowing where to hide, they decided that the danger of being captured was too great, forcing Harriet to come along. They gave up and returned home. Gathering food, Harriet set out again to escape, deliberately not telling any of the men, not her husband, not her father or brothers, moving alone. Quote, "Freedom is the recognition of necessity," end quote. She later said that her own thinking had broken through politically in an Amazon way in those few days. She has said to herself, quote, "There's 2 things I've got a right to, and these are death and liberty. One or the other I mean to have. No one will take me back alive. I shall fight for my liberty, and when the time has come for us to go, the Lord will let them kill me," end quote. In escaping, Harriet was redefining herself. Not only in relation to Southern slavery and the prison warden who claimed to own her, but in relation to men and the patriarchal family. She was constructing herself, creating her new identity as an Amazon. Never again, from that moment on, would Harriet Tubman place herself under the command of men in politics, war, or daily life. She left her family and would return as a guerrilla to rescue as many as she could. However, she was also freeing herself from them. The largest radical conspiracy in U.S. history. The Underground Railroad, when Harriet found it, had already been in existence for over 50 years. Not only as the largest radical conspiracy in U.S. history, involving many thousands, but as a major new front in the new Afrikan Liberation War. Every war has its own character, its unique unfolding, spontaneously. The mass revolutionary strategy of the New African slaves had first been to escape by any means necessary. Stranded on a strange continent, these trickles and streams of escapees flowed together to create free communities of new Africans in the north and in the Indian nations, to be seedbeds from which rebuilding offenses would grow, while at the same time robbing the slave power of illegitimate property and its already thin sense of security, weakening the pre-Confederate economy. We're speaking here of the people's strategy, worked out in practice by masses of captives and escapees themselves, of mass movements breaking out of prison camps and across borders. During the settlers' slave owners' 1776 to 1783 War of Independence from the British Empire, there was a great tidal wave of new Africans escaping and allying themselves with the British. It is an irony that today white leftist organizations name themselves after the settler patriarchal organizations of the day. The, quote, Committee of Correspondence for the original Committee of Correspondence organized night patrols of white men in the North to intercept and kill escaping Africans. Again, the book Settlers gives us true accounts of this suppressed story. Quote, the British, short of troops and laborers, decided to use both Indian nations and the African slaves to help bring down the settler rebels. This was nothing unique. The French had extensively used Indian military alliances, and the British extensively used African slave recruits in their 1756-63 war over North America, called the French and Indian Wars in settler history books. But the Euro-American settlers sitting in the dynamite of the restive, nationally oppressed African populations were terrified and outraged. This was the final proof to many settlers of King George III's evil tyranny. An English gentlewoman traveled into the colonies that wrote that popular settler indignation was so great that it stood to unite rebels and Tories again. Tom Paine, in his revolutionary pamphlet, Common Sense, raged against, quote, the barbarous and hellish powers that hath stirred up Indian and Negroes to destroy us, end quote. But oppressed people saw this war as a wonderful contradiction to be exploited in the ranks of the European capitalists. Lord Dunmore was royal governor of Virginia in name, but ruler over so little that he had to reside aboard British warships anchored offshore. Urgently needing reinforcements for his outnumbered command, on November 5th, 1975, he issued a proclamation that any slaves enlisting in his forces would be free. Sir Henry Clinton, commander of British forces in North America, later issued an even broader offer. Quote, I do most strictly forbid any person to sell or claim right over any Negro, the property of a rebel, who may claim refuge in any part of this army. And I do promise to every Negro who shall desert the rebel standard full security to follow within these lines any occupation which he shall think proper. Could any horn have called more clearly? By the thousands upon thousands, Africans struggled to reach British lines. One historian of the Exodus has said, quote, the British move was countered by the Americans, who exercised close vigilance over their slave, removed the able-bodied to interior places far from the scene of war, and threatened with dire punishment all those who sought to join the enemy. The Negro, attempting to flee to the British alternatives, liberty or death, took an almost literal meaning. Nevertheless, by land and sea, they made their way to British forces. The war was a disruption to slave America, a chaotic gap in the European capitalist ranks to be hit hard. Africans seized the times, not by tens or hundreds, but by many thousands. America shook with tremors of their movement. The signers of the Declarations of Independence were bitter about their personal losses. Thomas Jefferson lost many of his slaves. Virginia's Governor Benjamin Harris lost 30. William Lee lost 65, and said 2 of his neighbors lost every slave they had in the world. South Carolina's Arthur Middleton lost 50 slaves. Africans were writing their own declarations of independence by escaping. Many settler patriots tried to appeal to the British forces to exercise European solidarity and expel the rebel slaves. George Washington had to denounce his own brother for bringing food to the British troops, in a vain effort to coax them into returning the Washington family slaves. Yes, the settler patriots were definitely upset to see some real freedom get loose upon the land. To the day, no one really knows how many slaves freed themselves during the war. Georgia settlers were said to have lost over 10,000 slaves, where the number of African escaped prisoners in South Carolina and Virginia were thought to total well over 50,000. Many in the disruption of war passed themselves off as freemen and relocated in other territories, fled to British Florida and Canada, or took refuge in maroon communities with Indian nations. It has been estimated that 100,000 African prisoners, some 20% of the slave population, freed themselves during the war. The thousands of rebellious Africans sustained the British war machinery. After all, if the price of refuge from the slave master was helping the British throw down the settlers, it was not such a distasteful task. Lord Dunmore had, quote, Ethiopian regiment of ex-slaves who went into battle with the motto, Liberty to Slaves, sewn on their jackets, who helped the British capture and burn Norfolk, Virginia on New Year's Day, 1776. That must have been sweet, indeed. Everywhere, Africans appeared with the British units as soldiers, porters, road builders, guides, and intelligence agents. Washington declared that unless the slave escapes could be halted, the British army would inexorably grow like a snowball and rolling. What was primary for the African masses was a strategic relationship with the British Empire against settler America. To use an old European power against the Euro-American settlers, who were the nearest and most immediate enemy, was just common sense to many. 65,000 Africans joined the British forces, over 10 for every one enlisted in the continental U.S. ranks. Even in the ruins of British defeat, the soundness of the viewpoint was born in practice. While the jubilant patriots watched the defeated British army evacuate New York City in 1783, some 4,000 Africans swarmed about the departing ships to escape America. Another 4,000 Africans escaped with the British from Savannah, 6,000 from Charleston, and 5,000 escaped aboard British ships prior to the surrender. Did these brothers and sisters lose the war compared to those still in chains on the plantations? Others chose neither to leave nor submit. All during the war, Indian and African guerrillas struck at the settlers. In one case, 300 African ex-slaves fought an extended guerrilla campaign against the planters in both Georgia and South Carolina. Originally allied to the British forces, they continued their independent campaign long after the British defeat. They were not overcome until 1786, when their secret fort at Bear Creek was discovered and overwhelmed. This was one front in the true democratic struggle against America, end quote. And again, all that was from Settlers, Chase Cat. When Harriet Tubman reached the first, quote, free or non-slave city of Philadelphia, she met with William Still, the new African leader of the Underground Railroad there. Hooked up now and having a rear base area, Harriet became a self-sufficient conductor on the Underground Railroad, working most of the year as a laborer, cleaning or doing laundry or cutting wood to support herself and to save money for raids in the South. Twice a year, usually in the spring and fall, Harriet Tubman would travel hundreds of miles, much of it on foot, infiltrating slave territory to bring escapees out. She conducted 19 guerrilla raids, even reaching deep into the Carolina plantation country. While the Underground Railroad was famous in its own day, especially after being popularized in Harriet Beecher Stowe's best-selling novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, in 1852, it was very different than the images of daring white Quakers we are spoon-fed today. It was mainly composed of new Africans, not Euro-Americans. There were many white abolitionists in the North, but relatively few were willing to risk themselves or even contribute much money. In the South, a handful of, quote, free Africans and anti-slavery whites played a key role, but the river of new African prisoners breaking out was, of course, the largest single part of the Underground Railroad. Most of the, quote, station masters or brakemen, local Underground Railroad coordinators, were new African as well. And when it came to the over 500 conductors, those frontline guerrillas who had actually penetrated slave territory to lead prison breaks, virtually all were new African. It was their war. We've said it before, but we have to repeat it so that we really get it. The Underground Railroad that Harriet joined in 1849 came to help lead wasn't civilian, but was a military activity. In fact, it was the main black military activity in their protracted war against the slave system. It was a mass form of guerrilla warfare. That is the key that opens up an understanding about the nature of war by the oppressed, which is a level of understanding long denied women, but that we Amazons must break into. When the capitalist patriarchy praises the Underground Railroad with dusty words, it does so to mislead us, to turn us away from Harriet's own tracks. In our school days, the Underground Railroad is always falsely praised for being a humanitarian rescue, for being about new Africans seeking safety in the white North, as though the Underground were some Red Cross mission. As though the white North was safe for new African women. No, not at all, not even close to true when we really think about it. For the black guerrillas like Harriet, the North served as a rear base area for their long war against the slave system. Rear base areas are little discussed, but essential to guerrillas. This is something precise, a large area or territory bordering on the main battle zone where the other side cannot freely operate, either for reasons of remoteness or impenetrable mountain ranges, or because it crosses political boundaries. The North as a rear base gave new Africans the space to rest, repair, rebuild themselves. This was a deeper process than we've thought about. In real life, revolutionary guerrillas spend most of their time in their rear base areas, not out on raids. In China, Mao Zedong even thought that only one battle every 3 months was the right spacing for full-time guerrilla units, because it is the rear bases that the process of mass change, of the oppressed changing themselves into new people, educationally, politically, and class-wise, in identity, was centered. So rear bases were and are not passive, not like highway rest stops, and escaping northward for ex-slaves then wasn't an end in itself, but only a beginning. The War of Liberation was at work, just as hard in the northern rear base in the southern battle zone, although the shapes of the activities was clearly different. It is true that relatively few escapees became guerrillas, as Harriet did. Most New Africans in the North as individuals were largely concerned in their daily lives about finding jobs, caring for children, and all the other difficult demands of survival in Babylon. But as a community, what they had in common was the Liberation War. Their collective efforts, the institutions they built so painfully from nothing in a hostile land, the new leaders they raised up, were all about making the war against the slave system. Although the white North back then is sentimentally pictured for us as being the land of freedom, actually, it was cold and barren and hostile for New Africans. Before the Civil War, many towns and even entire states banned the New African residents, as almost did all skilled trades, professions, hospitals, schools, churches, and government services. To start a primary school for New African children in most northern towns then was seen as a shocking crime, and often such attempts were burned to the ground by angry white mobs. There was nothing black, no progress or failure. But that was not a part of the Liberation War. If Harriet Tubman lived in the North, working as a laborer 9 or 10 months a year during her guerrilla wars, this was not a timeout. If William still wore a suit and tie, worked as a clerk in Philadelphia during those years, that didn't make him a civilian. He was a major leader of the single largest eastern station on the Underground Railroad. Every black community association or institution back then was involved in the war, and the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Lower Manhattan was the first formal New African church, formally in a split from a white church that wasn't militant enough for them against slavery. For years, it and sister churches throughout the North acted against the law as dissident political centers and hideouts for fugitive New Africans. Again, the rear base in the North wasn't a passive refuge, but an area of possible advantage and also danger that had to be continually fought for, enlarged, and changed, which Harriet Tubman was very busy doing all the time. Virtually none of this was recorded in men's history, of course, since the actual fabric of women's politics has always been judged too trivial for that. When Harriet took poor children in a communal way, urging everyone to construct their households in similar communal fashions, this was a political statement so strong that few women here and now can even discuss it. While there was already anti-capitalist in the U.S. at the time, Harriet's working-class politics weren't expressed ideologically, but in living her New African communalism. Although she never hid her political view that it was wrong to have any personal wealth or advantage whatsoever. The constant struggle by Harriet and her comrades to build a New African culture in the northern rear base area grew more visible after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. Not only were, quote, slave catchers and federal marshals, the forerunners of today's FBI's, seizing escaped Africans, but in the shadows of this law, white kidnappings of any Africans in the North for quick sale on southern auction blocks was taking place. A movement of legal but open mass resistance arose to the U.S. criminal justice system, a mass movement that rescued New African prisoners and fought the police and courts and federal marshals. Like all true mass struggles, it had many leaders and many brilliant local battles. One of the most famous was when the Battle of Troy, New York, which was led by an illiterate working-class woman who herself was a fugitive with a bounty on her head, none other than Harriet Tubman. For you see, in real life, America's most wanted was a working-class New African woman. On April 27, 1860, Harriet Tubman was traveling to Boston to attend a large anti-slavery meeting. Stopping in Troy to visit a relative, she was immediately told that a fugitive New African, Charles Nail, had been captured by the slavers. Federal marshals were holding him at a downtown courthouse, where his so-called enslaver was applying to a U.S. commissioner for Nail's return and change back to Virginia. Those at the hearing were surprised, for the 30-year-old Nail and the slaver looked strikingly alike, different only in a shade of skin color. They were biologically two brothers with the same father, but one a captive laborer and one the prison warden. Downtown stores had closed as everyone was going to the courthouse to see the Roman spectacle. Harriet had helped quickly organize a conspiracy. With her face hidden in a large shawl, carrying a basket, Harriet bent over, acting like an old woman. 2 other women were by her side, pretending to support her by the arms. Tugging the guard by his coat, Harriet persuaded him to admit the, quote, harmless woman to the courtroom, where she sank down in the doorway. Outside, a New African man named William Henry started speaking to the crowd, covertly warning some of them among them to get ready. Quote, "There's a fugitive in that office. Pretty soon you will see him come forth. He's going to be taken to the depot to go to Virginia on the first train." End quote. Henry, who was an unknown laborer, is believed to be Harriet's brother and a relative she was visiting in Troy. When the U.S. Commissioner ruled against Nale, the prisoner suddenly leapt forward to the window, stepping out onto the ledge. Cries of support came from below, but his hopes to jump down into the crowd were cut off when federal agents grabbed him and dragged him back into the office. As the local newspaper reported, quote, "The crowd at the time numbered nearly 1,000 persons. Many were black and a good share were of the female sex. They blocked up the State Street from First Street to the alley and kept surging to and fro," end quote. Nale's defense attorney, Martin Townsend, delayed the slavers by filing an emergency appeal right then and there. He won an order demanding that Nale's appearance before a judge of the state Supreme Court. As the slavers and federal agents convoyed the chained Nale out, Harriet Tubman rose and threw off her disguise. Racing to the open window, she shouted to the anti-slavery fighters mixed in the crowd, quote, "Here he comes! Take him!" end quote. Harriet and her underground group had arranged for a boat to be secretly waiting at the rivers outside of town. She ran to the courthouse stairs, overtaking the federal party and breaking into their circle. Locking her arms with nails, Harriet began pulling him away from the U.S. Marshals. Quote, "This man shall not go back to slavery," end quote. She shouted, "Take him, friends. Drag him to the river," end quote. In the middle of the crowded downtown street, a small battle raged. Federal agents and police swung their clubs, and some drew their pistols and began firing. New African guerrillas and their white allies charged into them. Nale himself fought desperately to get free. Side by side with Harriet, attorney Martin Townsend witnessed it all. Quote, "In the melee, she was repeatedly beaten over the head with policemen's clubs, but she never for a moment released her hold, but cheered Nale and his friends with her voice and struggled with the officers until they were literally worn out with their exertions, and Nale was separated from them," end quote. They hurried Nale down to the river, where a sympathetic ferryman rowed them to the other side. But no sooner had a bloodied and exhausted Nale touched the shore again than he was recaptured. This time, the U.S. Marshals and police rushed him under heavy guard to Police Justice Stewart's office, where they barricaded. Just in time, as Harriet had led a rush of 400 anti-slavers onto the steam ferry boat and across the river, when the U.S. Marshals hiding inside started firing wildly at the surrounding force. Someone rallied the attackers. "They can only kill a dozen of us." New African men charged up the stairs and forced open the door. The first of them was cut down by a hatchet swung by Deputy Sheriff Morrison. His body stuck in the doorway, though, so the door could not be slammed shut. The anti-slavery men broke in, but they were overcome in hand-to-hand fighting one by one. Then, as attorney Townsend tells us, it was all one squad of black Amazons to win or lose the battle. Quote, "And when the men who led the assault upon the door of Judge Stewart's office were strucken down, Harriet and a number of other colored women rushed over their bodies, brought Nale out, and put him into the first wagon passing, starting him for the west," end quote. After the battle, U.S. Marshals tried to hunt them down, but members of the underground hid them well, and an entire New African nation protected Harriet. How shallow is today's false image of Harriet as a lone, non-political do-gooder when we glimpse her reality as an Amazon leader and of an entire people at war. What was happening in the guerrilla war was that violent battles were taking place not only in the South, but in the North as well. Thousands upon thousands of New Africans created battlegrounds and endured real costs and real casualty and bitter struggles. Women easily as much as men. In that long, difficult, and successful process to develop the North as a vibrant rear base for war, women and men stepped up to recreate themselves in dignity. Quote, "Freedom is never given, but only won," end quote. And that was it. You'll get more of these soon, and even sooner if you head over to our Patreon. Actually, I think I have something about that right now.
Hey listeners, this is The Dugout, and we're all about sharing Black radical history and ideas to spark learning and action. If you've gained something from these conversations, you might want to consider supporting us on the Patreon. Your support helps us cover production costs, bringing on amazing guests, and create resources for deeper education. Plus, you'll get early access to the interviews and exclusive reading episodes. Head to patreon.com/thedugoutpod and join. Keep this work going.